So they had a big problem. Their house was flooded. However, in actuality, the flooded house was just a consequence of not dealing with the real problem. You see, sometime before this, they had noticed warm spots in their floor. And they had this warm spot, and if you don't know, a warm spot could indicate that you have a broken hot water pipe under your slab. But they noticed the warm spot, and someone told them that is an area where pipes are very likely running through your house. But you know what they did? They ignored it and hoped it would go away. They just wanted to pretend like it wasn't even happening. They acted like nothing was wrong. Because they didn't want to be inconvenienced. They didn't want to pay the price of having it fixed. But now they had a much bigger problem and a much bigger cost of repair. Well, this is like Israel. They had a problem. They were being unfaithful to God, and they were following other false gods. They had been warned by the prophets. They had been reminded of the covenant promises, and by that I mean both the positive promises and the negative promises, the blessings if you obey, the cursings if you disobey. But they ignored it all, and they acted like nothing was wrong. You see, they didn't want to change. They didn't want to be inconvenienced. And they even assumed that things might get better because they were going through their religious rituals and because they were praying to other gods as well. Now, this is even worse than ignoring a broken water pipe. It's kind of like assuming that broken water pipe is going to somehow make your house better. That when it bursts, it's going to improve your home rather than flood your home. So Hosea comes along, and Hosea's ministry was to help Israel see just how wrong what they were doing was, and to tell them that big trouble was coming, and that there was an obvious solution. So we can begin Hosea chapter 1 and verse 1. It says, "The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel." Okay, so Hosea's ministry, it actually spanned a time of about 30 years. And so it was while Jeroboam and several others were kings in Israel, and while Uzziah and a few others were kings in Judah. Like Amos, who we just read about, like Amos, Hosea's message is directed to the northern kingdom of Israel, although he does also mention Judah as well. And so, if you remember, Israel is enjoying a time of prosperity right now, and there is a less of a threat from foreign nations because God had compassion on his people. But God in this time having compassion on his people, this didn't produce thankfulness and faithfulness in their lives as it should have. Instead, the moral decay and the idolatry just continued to grow in Israel. So verse 2 says, "When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, 'Go take to yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord.'" Okay, so God gives Hosea a command to go get married. And Hosea's life is going to be an object lesson. It's a picture of the relationship between God and Israel. And so his wife will be unfaithful to him and will illustrate Israel's unfaithfulness to God, Israel's turning away from God. But God tells him, go take a wife of whoredom, or a prostitute, or a promiscuous woman. Now, it's not clear from the command if this woman is already a prostitute, or a woman of questionable character, or if this is speaking in a way that anticipates what she will become. Of course, if this is speaking in a way that anticipates what she will become, she still may not have had the strongest of character. But I think that it is anticipating. And she may not have had the highest of character, because this fits Israel's actual situation. You see, when God delivered Israel from Egypt, and he took her as his own, and he made a covenant with her. At that time, Israel wasn't perfect. They had some issues, some faith and obedience problems. But they happily and fully committed themselves to God and to his covenant. But later turned to other gods, became unfaithful. So he tells him, go take this wife. He also tells him to have kids with this wife. In other words, he says, have children of whoredom, or children from this relationship with this woman. And so we will be told of the births of 3 children here as we continue to read. The first one is clearly Hosea's legitimate child, because the text says she bore him a son. Now the second and third, it's not so clear. The text simply says she conceived and she bore a daughter or a son. It doesn't specify that they are his. Now this could simply be shortened because it's understood or it's a given, but it seems to be leaving things purposely ambiguous. So we might question, are these Hosea's biological kids or not? So at the very least, the mother's actions and her character have raised questions and caused uncertainty. And so this is just driving home the point that she is unfaithful. Well, let's keep reading. Verse 3, chapter 1, verse 3. It says, so he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, call his name Jezreel, for in just a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. So Hosea marries Gomer, and they have a son. And God tells him what to name the boy. You see, the names of his children are going to be part of the object lesson. And so he names the boy Jezreel. And if you remember, when we studied this, Jezreel was a town in Israel. It was the town where Jehu had killed Ahab's son Joram, or Jehoram, who was king of Israel. It's also where Jezebel was killed. It's also where Jehu had all of Ahab's other sons killed in Samaria and had their heads sent there to Jezreel and piled their heads up at the gate. So we talked about this a while back, and when we saw this, we said that Jehu was carrying out God's judgment on Ahab. But as we discuss it, it also seems that he may have been more brutal and excessive than he needed to be. And so Hosea's son is named Jezreel after that town in order to predict that Jehu's dynasty and the nation of Israel will be overthrown. And eventually there will be no longer a king in Israel. Verse 6. She conceived again and bore a daughter, and the Lord said to him, call her name No Mercy. For I will no more have mercy on the house of Israel to forgive them at all. But I will have mercy on the house of Judah, and I will save them by the Lord their God. I will not save them by bow or by sword or by war or by horses or by horsemen. So Gomer gives birth to a daughter, and God tells him to name her Lo Ruhamah, which means no mercy. And this points to the fact that God will not continue to show Israel mercy. that he has up until this point, but that he will allow them now to suffer the consequences of their sins, of their actions. But he makes this little statement that God will continue to have mercy on Judah. See, Judah has not gotten to the place, has not gone downhill as far as the northern kingdom of Israel has yet. So he says, I will continue to have mercy on Judah. Now, he doesn't specify how he's going to do that, but he does specify how he won't do that. He says, it won't be by war. I will not save them through war. So God is going to show them mercy, but he is going to do it directly. He will directly intervene in their lives. Verse 8, and when she had weaned no mercy, she conceived and bore a son. And the Lord said, call his name Not My People, or Lo Ami. For you are not my people, and I am not your God. So they have another son. His name is Lo Ami, not my people. But this is striking, because this is actually the opposite of what God's covenant to Israel said. See, when God made the covenant with Israel, he said, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. But now, God is saying, you're not my people. You see, Israel has broken the covenant, and they have worshiped other gods, and God is now saying, in some sense, that the relationship is severed. Now, this is a jarring thing to hear. And it's unexpected, and it makes you wonder, how could this be? But the next verses immediately make it clear that this is not a total severing of the relationship. You see, God seems to be overstating it when he says, not my people. He seems to be overstating to make a point. Let's keep reading. Verse 10. He says, yet the number of the children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, it shall be said to them, children of the living God. And the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head, and they shall go up from the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. Chapter 2, verse 1, say to your brothers, you are my people, and to your sisters, you have received mercy. So God has not fully rejected Israel, because immediately after saying, you are not my people, and I am not your God, he continues with, yet, and then restates a promise that is taken from the covenant with Abraham, that Israel will be innumerable. And so he immediately goes back to that covenant with Abraham. And he says, at this place where you were called not my people, you will later be called children of God, children of the living God. And so this relationship will be restored, and they will be called something even better. Oh, it's great being called the people of God, but the children of God, an even closer relationship. And his people will then tell each other about this. They will call each other, you are the children of God. You are the people of God. See, they will know that they wandered away. They will know that they were shown mercy. And they have been reconciled to God. And they will talk about it amongst themselves. But here's the thing. This also looks forward to Israel and Judah being reunited under one king. And then returning to the land and to the fulfillment of God's covenant with Abraham. Now, these things were partially fulfilled when Israel returned to the land after the exile, but not completely. Also, Romans chapter 9 quotes from this passage in Hosea, quotes from the text, and applies it to Gentiles who were not my people, but who have been brought into the people of God and called sons of the living God. It's talking about us there. Isn't that awesome? Children of God. But this ultimately looks forward to the kingship of Jesus in his millennial kingdom and his eternal kingdom. Chapter 2, verse 2. It says, plead with your mother. Plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband, that she may put away her whoring from her face and her adultery from between her breasts. Lest I strip her naked and make her as of the day she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and make her like a parched land, and kill her with thirst. Upon her children also I will have no mercy, because they are children of whoredom. For their mother has played the whore. She who conceived them has acted shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers, who have given me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink. Therefore, I will hedge her way with thorns, and I will build a wall against her, so that she cannot find her paths. She shall pursue her lovers, but not overtake them, and she shall seek them, but shall not find them. Then she shall say, I will go and return to my first husband, for it was better for me then than now. And she did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, and the oil, and who lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. Therefore I will take back my grain in its time, and my wine in its season, and I will take away my wool and my flax, which were to cover her nakedness. Now I will uncover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and no one shall rescue her out of my hand. And I will put an end to her mirth, her feasts, her new moons, her Sabbaths, and all her appointed feasts. And I will lay waste her vines and her fig trees, of which she says, these are my wages, which my lovers have given me. I will make them a forest, and the beasts of the field shall devour them. And I will punish her for the feast days of the Baals, when she burned offerings to them and adorned herself with her ring and jewelry, and went after her lovers and forgot me, declares the Lord. So God here continues to address the future restored generation, and he tells them to bring a charge against their mother. In other words, against the earlier unfaithful generation of Hosea's day. In other words, you know what they did wrong, bring a charge against them. And all of these verses, they speak of Israel illustrated through Gomer. So we get two things kind of mixed in here. We have Israel's situation and the Gomer and Hosea situation. And so it's illustrating Israel. But Israel is like an unfaithful wife. So Gomer is a woman who dresses up in order to attract men. And she flaunts her infidelity with no shame. So Israel is doing with their idolatry. Gomer will be made like wilderness and parched land, which is probably a picture of infertility. But so Israel will suffer drought, and the land will not produce. Gomer chases after her lovers, and she thinks that they provide her with what she wants and what she needs. So her husband will then take her and keep her away from them, not allow her to get to them, so that she comes to her senses and returns to her husband, Hosea. So Israel chases after her idols, her false gods. And they think that those idols, those false gods, provide for them. And they think that those idols are helping them. And so God will cut them off from those idols and make life hard for them, make it so they can't get to those idols, and make it so that life is difficult while they are in exile. He's going to take them out of the land so that they will wake up and figure it out and return to God. But at the beginning of those verses, beginning of verse 2, God says of Israel, she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. It's stated here as if the relationship is over, like there's been a divorce. But then God speaks as if she is his wife. And so again, it seems that he is overstating the case to make the point here that the relationship is broken. Things aren't right. things need to change. So God will discipline Israel and bring her back to him. They must stop their infidelity. Verse 14. Therefore, behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. And there I will give her vineyards and make the valley of Achor a door of hope. And there she shall answer as in the days of her youth, as at the time when she came out of the land of Egypt. And in that day declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and no longer will you call me my Baal. For I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, and they shall be remembered by name no more. And I will make for them a covenant on that day with the beasts of the fields and the birds of the heaven and the creeping things of the ground. And I will abolish the bow, the sword and war from the land. And I will make you lie down in safety, and I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love and in mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. And in that day I will answer, declares the Lord. I will answer the heavens, and they shall answer the earth. And the earth shall answer the grain, the wine, the oil, and they shall answer Jezreel. And I will sow her for myself in the land, and I will have mercy on no mercy. And I will say to not my people, you are my people. And he shall say, you are my God. So after making things difficult for Israel, God will take her out and woo her. God is pictured like a man who is speaking softly and lovingly towards a woman. This man is trying to get her attention. He's pursuing her. He wants her to fall in love with him. You see, God says he's going to bring her into the wilderness, which refers to taking Israel into exile outside of the land. Now, this is definitely discipline on Israel, but it's also pictured like God is getting away with his people to have some time alone. You see, the wilderness also reminds us of the Exodus and the wanderings, which wasn't all good. But going into the wilderness is reminiscent of the early time of their relationship with God. So this is like a couple that is thinking back or revisiting a place where they were when they were newlyweds. And it brings up those feelings, and it reminds you of why you fell in love. The point is here that God will pursue his people. He will pursue Israel and make her love him again. And that relationship will be renewed, and it will be permanent. In chapter 3, verse 1, it says, and the Lord said to me, so Hosea is speaking here, the Lord said to me, go again, love a woman who is loved by another man and is an adulteress, even as the Lord loves the children of Israel. Though they turn to other gods and love cakes of raisins, cakes of raisins has to do with idolatrous worship. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a lethek of barley. And I said to her, you must dwell as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore or belong to another man. So will I also be to you. In other words, you be faithful to me, I will be faithful to you. For the children of Israel shall dwell many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or pillar, without ephod or household gods. Afterward, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and they shall come in fear to the Lord and to his goodness in the latter days. So here we see this process that we've been talking about being played out in Hosea's life. Again, Hosea's life, his marriage is an illustration of what God is doing for Israel. So Hosea, he goes and he gets his wife and he brings her home. But he has to pay to reclaim her. and to set her free. Now, we don't know why exactly, but it seems that she has indebted herself in some way, or she maybe has sold herself as a slave and has to be bought back. And so Hosea buys her back. He redeems her. And then she remains with him for a period of time and is chaste. And this time is a time of purification and of learning faithfulness. And it pictures Israel's time in exile, where they learn to be faithful to God and will seek God. In fact, when Israel returns from exile, they never again have a problem with idolatry or worshiping false gods. They learned that. They may have some other issues, but this is not one of them. Idolatry is not one of them once they come back to the land. But in these chapters, we see that God is faithful and that he expects faithfulness from his people, and that he will discipline us to help us learn to be faithful. Because to turn from God and to chase after other things of this world that promise you joy and promise you fulfillment, that joy and fulfillment that really can only be found in God, but to turn from God to those things is no small thing. In fact, it's spiritual adultery. So don't put other things before God. Don't put things or people, even family, in God's place. He alone is God, and he is to be first in our lives. Well, at this point, we move on from the illustration of Hosea's life. And God starts bringing charges against Israel. He says, I have some controversies with you. So we have some controversial issues. Chapter 4, verse 1 to 3 says, Hear the word of the Lord, O children of Israel, for the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or steadfast love, and no knowledge of God in the land. There is swearing, lying, murder, stealing, and committing adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore the land mourns, and all who dwell in it languish, and also the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, and even the fish of the sea are taken away. So God is taking issue with some things in Israel. God has a problem with them, and he calls them to account. Well, he says there's no loyalty towards God, no loyal love towards God. He says that they don't acknowledge God's authority or who he is or what he's done for them or his faithfulness towards them. And they don't acknowledge what God expects from his people. And you notice there he says there's no. But then he turns around and says, but there are some things. There's some things here that should not be here. There's sin in Israel. You see, they violated the covenant. And all those things listed off are things of the covenant. They violated. And as a result, the land mourns, it says. In other words, they are suffering the consequences of breaking the covenant. They're experiencing the promised and agreed upon curses of the covenant. Now, chapters 4 and 5 continues on, and it continues this case against Israel. And it really emphasizes the leaders in Israel. In fact, it talks about the priests. The priests are not teaching the truth, and they're allowing this empty worship practices of Israel to continue on. You know why? So they get to eat. Because remember, the priests ate from some of the sacrifices that were brought. Well, so they let them carry on in their illegitimate worship practices and rituals because the priests are wanting to eat more. So they say, that's fine, go ahead and do it. And then they even allow pagan, idolatrous worship to go on. Catch this, just in case it might help. You see, the priests are falling short. The leadership is falling short. So they weren't faithful to God, but they did what they thought might benefit themselves. And God says, you're guilty. So let's just look at a few specific verses here that have particular application to today. Chapter 4, verse 6 says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I reject you from being a priest to me. And since you have forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children. Now, the first phrase, it says, for my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. This is a well-known phrase, and I think often quoted. But I think almost every time I hear it quoted, it's used to say we need education. That is not what this passage is talking about. This passage is not talking about math and science and history and reading and writing. Not that those are bad things to learn, but that is not what this text is talking about. This text is talking about knowing God and acknowledging God. See, this is why the people are destroyed, because they're not acknowledging God. They don't know God. So Israel was in trouble, and they were doing wrong because they didn't know or acknowledge God. They weren't being taught the truth of God. They didn't know him, and they rejected God. Sounds very similar to our culture today. There is nothing so important than to know and to be taught the truth of God. People need to know God. People need to acknowledge God for who he is and need to believe in him and come to him in faith. Chapter 4, verse 12. It says, my people inquire of a piece of wood, and their walking staffs give them oracles. For a spirit of whoredom has led them astray, and they have left their God to play the whore. I read these words, and I hear the ridicule in God's voice. God is like, it's like saying, how ridiculous it is that you would pray to a stick. It's a stick. A piece of dead wood. How senseless. It makes no sense that you would pray to a stick. Why would you think that a piece of wood could give you answers? Well, God goes on to say that they have turned from him and they have a spirit of whoredom or adultery. In other words, they are totally unfaithful to God. And I think this explains the first part. Why would you do something so senseless? You see, when people rebel against God, they do senseless things. They do things that just don't make sense. In fact, Romans 1 says that when people refuse to acknowledge God, that he turns them over, gives them over to a depraved mind. You know what a depraved mind is? A mind that doesn't work right. It doesn't think straight. And so these people who are in rebellion against God will say and think and do things that just make no sense at all. I could give you many examples from our world today, but you know what they are. There's a lot of nonsense in our world. There's a lot of rebellion against God in our world. Chapter 4, verse 15. Though you play the whore, O Israel, let not Judah become guilty. Enter not into Gilgal, nor up to Beth Haven, and swear not as the Lord lives. And this, Judah is being warned here. Don't follow in the footsteps of Israel. Your relatives, your neighbors. He said, don't be like them. You see, they were still more faithful than Israel. And he's saying, don't be like them. Sadly, it doesn't last. Judah does follow in their footsteps and follows in the same ways that Israel goes. But see, this is a reminder to the faithful that you need to be careful. You need to be careful not to take on the ways of the unfaithful. You may think, well, I would never do that. Well, that's what Judah would say. You might say, I would never do that, but be careful. This world can be enticing. When everyone around you says, Do this with us. Think this way. Don't think that way. That's crazy. That's old-fashioned, or that's whatever. Don't think that way. Think like us. Act like us. Become like us. It's so easy to follow others away from the truth, away from what is right, away from what is godly. So watch out and stand firm. Stay faithful to God. So, why does God judge the sin of his people? Why does he discipline? I mean, what's the point? Turn to chapter 5, down to verse 13. Chapter 5, verse 13, it says, when Ephraim he's referring to Israel there. Ephraim was one of the larger tribes of Israel. When Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah his wound, then Ephraim went to Assyria and sent to the great king, but he is not able to cure you or heal your wound. For I will be like a lion to Ephraim, and like a young lion to the house of Judah. Even I, God speaking, will tear and go away. I will carry off, and no one shall rescue. I will return again to my place until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face. In their distress, earnestly seek me. Now, at different times, following this, at different times in Israel's and Judah's history, at different times both Israel and Judah will end up running to the king of Assyria for help. Now, why do they need help? Well, they need help because God is judging them for their sin. Things have gotten hard for them. Other enemies come in against them. So they run to Assyria. So they go to the king of Assyria for help. But God says he won't be able to help them. Why? Because it's God who's bringing this trouble upon them. And no man can stand against God. You can't stop God. And so God is pictured here like a lion who is tearing apart his prey. They can't escape his judgment. But here's the thing. God doesn't just stop there at judgment. He moves on to restoration. You see, judgment isn't the final objective. God isn't just judging in vengeance. The ultimate goal, the ultimate purpose of God's judgment is that his people will repent of their sin and return to him. You see, God wants people to seek him. And so Hosea, he gets to this point and he hears this. And it almost seems like he just can't contain himself. And so he makes appeal to the people. Look at of Israel. Look at chapter 6, verse 1 through 3. He says, come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us, that he may heal us. He has struck us down, and he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up, that we may live before him. Let us know. Let us press on to know the Lord. His going out is sure as the dawn. He will come to us as the showers and as the spring rain that waters the earth. And so Hosea has talked about Israel's sin. He's talked about their unfaithfulness. He's talked about God's judgment and the hardship that God will bring upon them. He's talked about God's love and his compassion and God's desire to bless his people. Well, the only thing that makes sense is that they would get right with God. And so he calls for Israel to repent and to return to God. He challenges those who have experienced God's discipline to recognize it for what it is and to turn away from their sin and turn to God. And he is certain that if they do, God will forgive and will bless them, and they can then live for him. You see, this is the solution to their big problem. Is turn to God in faith. This is the answer. This is the point. Get right with God. Follow God. Seek God. Be faithful to him. There is no good reason to turn away from God. When you see who he is and his goodness and you see his discipline, there is no good reason to turn away from God and to suffer discipline. So be faithful to him. Commit yourself fully to him and live for his pleasure and his glory. You see, God uses the picture of adultery here to illustrate what it's like when his people are unfaithful. Why? Why the picture of adultery? I think it's because adultery is something that we understand. We know that adultery is a terrible thing. Most people, even people who don't have any problems with most or moral issues with most sexual sins, or sexual activity, as they would put it, people who have no problems with most of those things do have a problem with cheating on your spouse. They say, that's wrong. That's evil. And so we understand this picture. We understand that cheating is wrong. Adultery is wrong. But for some reason, people don't feel as strongly about cheating against God. Cheating on God. We just don't think of it the same. I don't know why that is, but it's often considered not quite as bad. But this picture tells us that it is. It's bad. Being unfaithful to God, it's terrible. Being unfaithful to God is as serious as being unfaithful to your spouse. I would say more. But you get the picture. Judgment is deserved. God expects faithfulness. God deserves our faithfulness. But even when God's people fail to be faithful, God loves and pursues them. He will discipline and he will tenderly call them back to himself. The only reasonable response is to turn to him and to receive his forgiveness and his grace. See, God has given us the solution to our problem.